Hello, my name is Paul Stewart, and in this video I'm going to talk about the Qantas Boeing 747 and then take you on board a short domestic hop from Sydney through to Brisbane. And during all of that, I'll go off on tangents and talk about a few of the details that make this airliner unique to Qantas and the world. But first, let's start with some history. For decades, international travel was pretty uncomfortable on board airliners such as the DC-3 and the Super Constellation. In the early 1950s, the de Havilland Comet was the first jet airliner to enter service, followed by the far more successful Boeing 707. While it was impressive for the time, and this one is currently retired at the Qantas Fanners Museum in Longreach, the Boeing 747 was something completely radical, mostly because it was absolutely massive. The very first Boeing 747-100 was never sold to Qantas, and this one you're seeing now inside the Museum of Flight in Seattle is the actual prototype that first flew in February 1969. I've got videos from that museum on my channel, and I'll include a link to those below. The first jumbos Qantas purchased were the upgraded Dash 200s, and the one you see now in Longreach is one of those. Qantas also purchased the Dash 300, which had a few more improvements, including the stretched upper deck, although the biggest changes were saved for 1989 when the 747-400 went into service. On the outside, the main differences were the longer upper deck and the 180cm winglets. Inside, the flight engineer was replaced by an upgraded computer and a glass cockpit. Here is me in an older Dash 200, and then here I am in the Dash 400, and you'll notice that a lot of the round dials have been replaced by screens. Another interesting change was the option of inserting fuel tanks into the horizontal stabilizers at the back, and with that extra range they were able to fly non-stop for 20 hours and 9 minutes from London to Sydney back in 1989. Now, I should point out that they had barely any passengers or luggage on board, hence why it was only just a once-off to prove that it could be done and it wasn't economically viable to continue. Every Qantas 747-400 was branded with the Longreach name in recognition of the outback, Queensland town where it all began, and because the plane could quite literally reach a long way. And as always, the aircraft are also named after a town or city somewhere in Australia, with my aircraft today being named after the South Australian town of Ceduna. Now let's head inside Sydney Airport and find our aircraft for today's flight, after paying a brief homage to the aircraft that started it all, a wooden and fabric Avro 504K. Then it was through security and off to the departure gate. Usually such a large aircraft isn't put onto domestic flights, with the 737 and A330 doing most of the short-haul work. We were lucky today because the aircraft was running an Antarctica day flight out of Brisbane, so 364 plane nerds went along for the ride. Now, while I did travel in business, and mostly because the view of the wing and engines is better, I won't mention the lounge or the service and things like that in particular because, as I said before, I want to focus this video on the aircraft itself. And here is our aircraft, VH Oscar Echo India, which is a 747-400 ER, which stands for Extended Range, and was delivered to Qantas brand new in 2003. It was the 56th jumbo jet delivered to Qantas, and the 140th Boeing aircraft delivered to the Flying Red Roo. Now, keen listeners will have noticed that I called it an ER, and interestingly, Qantas are the only airline in the world to have ever bought the passenger ER model. As you can see, the view from Sydney is pretty poor, so I'll skip ahead to Brisbane while I run you through a few of the details. The extended range Dash 400s, of which Qantas had 6 of them, are the only remaining jumbos in their fleet, and sometimes called the 910Ks, recognising the 910,000 pound or just over 400,000 kilograms maximum takeoff weight, and literally over half of that weight can be made up of fuel. The increased takeoff weight was due to strengthening of the landing gear and structural modifications, so we could either have an extra 1 or 2 fuel tanks and therefore fly another 800 kilometres, or carry an extra 6,800 kilograms of freight. And finally, the ER model only came with these uprated General Electric CF6 engines. Now let's get back to Sydney and board this beautiful big plane. It also seems appropriate that the aircraft next to us was the replacement for this one, the 787-9 Dreamliner. This particular one, VH Zulu November Delta, was only delivered last year and is painted in the Yam Dreaming Indigenous art livery. And here we are boarding the 747, where I'll have a brief look up the Queen's nose on the left, and then turn right and find my seat 7K in the second last row of the business cabin. There's also more business seats in the upper deck, although the windows are angled a little upwards, so the view of the engine and wing isn't quite as good. As I said before, I genuinely only flew in business, because I wanted a good view. Once we all boarded, we backed out and prepared the aircraft for takeoff. Now this includes extending the Kruger flaps, which are unique to the 747 and only a few other aircraft. They extend out from underneath the leading edge and in front of the wing and appear in contrast to this style of slat in the Boeing 777 or the Finnair A350, where they're actually a part of the leading edge and just droop down a little bit. The Kruger flaps work well and allow you to engineer a thinner wing, which helps at cruising speed, but they're quite complicated. Now behind the wing, and I caught this footage last year from seat 55K, you can see that the 3-part slotted flaps extend, which increase the surface area of the wing by about a fifth. These, in conjunction with the Kruger flaps in the front, increase lift at low speeds but get retracted at cruising speed because you don't need lift as much then, and you want to decrease the drag. It's now time for me to briefly stop talking, and we'll listen to the 4 CF6s spool up as we take off from runway 16 right. I'll upload the full unedited takeoff in a separate video, so this will just include the highlight. We had already climbed to 37,000 feet by the time we crossed the coastline just north of Newcastle at a cruising speed of around 900 kilometers an hour. We had this drag with a Qantas 737-800 and we won, and we continued up the eastern coastline. Unfortunately today, there were a number of bad bushfires raging out of control essentially along the entire route we flew, and you'll be able to see that Brisbane was blanketed in smoke on our arrival. Here's footage on board my 737 back to Sydney later that afternoon. I gobbled down a quick meal, which was chicken, and then returned to looking out the window. Keen observers will have noticed that this particular 747 was painted with goat wallabies, and the flying kangaroo at the tail was carrying a ball. Now Qantas have been major sponsors of the Australian rugby team for a number of years, and this particular aircraft took our team to the World Cup in Japan just a month ago. That's all we're going to talk about it. Just above Grafton, we started our descent into a smoky Brisbane. Our flight, which was only 64 minutes long, was coming to an end, so it's fitting to mention why the Boeing 747 is being retired. In the late 1990s and 2000s, both Airbus and Boeing were developing their new flagship airliners. Airbus spent a bucketload of money on the mechanical marvel that is their A380, while Boeing decided, which in retrospect was probably a good idea, to simply majorly upgrade the 747-400. So in 2010, the 747-8 first flew and went into service the following year. Lufthansa were the launch partner of the passenger version, and you can check out my channel for my review of that. The main changes were stretching the fuselage and the upper deck, so it's now the longest passenger airliner, surpassing the Airbus A340-600. The wings were also significantly upgraded and visually quite different, as you can see with the raked wingtips from footage I captured on board one last year, rather than the winglets seen on the Dash 400. There was also only a single engine option with these General Electric Gen X engines, which are intended to replace the CF6s seen on our aircraft today and are also shared with the 787 Dreamliner. Unfortunately, the reality is for the 747 that as engine technology improves, anything with 4 engines is just too thirsty. Fortunately for us, Lufthansa, Korean and Air China have purchased passenger versions of the 747-8, so we'll see them around for at least another 10 years, although the freighter version is actually much more popular and is actually the only model that remains in production. This is particularly interesting and leads on to another tangent. Now, the early models of the 747 didn't even have passenger seats on the upper deck, so it raises the question of why the 747 had 2 levels at all. Otherwise, it was just the width of the aircraft that was important, as up until then, including with aircraft like the 707, everything was just a single aisle narrow body. Back when the 747 was being developed, everyone's attention was on supersonic transport with the Anglo-French Concorde, Russian Tu-144 program and Boeing's own 2707. The expectation was that most passengers would fly supersonic, so the way of future-proofing the Jumbo was to design it as a freighter. With the flight deck up and out of the way, the whole nose would open up, making it much easier to load freight, similar to the C5 Galaxy and Antonov 124. As so happened, Boeing cancelled their 2707, the TU-144 was a disaster, and Concorde wasn't profitable, so the 747 in both passenger and freighter form went on to become one of the most successful and profitable airliners ever. Unfortunately for the 747, the final nail in the coffin actually came from within. With improved engine designs and increased ETOPS ratings, which are essentially the rules about how far a plane with only 2 engines can fly away from an airport and over water, 2-engine airliners like the Boeing 777 are able to carry almost as many passengers but with much better fuel economy. And now Airbus also have their big twin airliner, the A350, and even Boeing are a year or two away from launching their new 777X. While Qantas could fly the A380 for another 10 or so years, the 747 fleet has almost already been completely replaced by a fleet of 787 Dreamliners. While these are smaller, they're much cheaper to run, and obviously they're easier to fill as there's less seats, so they don't need to have to do big discounts just to fill the plane. Just a few decades ago, this amazing piece of engineering opened up the world to travel and dramatically decreased the cost of flying. Not only does the 747 have a special place for the flying public, but for Qantas specifically. In fact, between the years of 1979 and 1985, Qantas only flew 747s, as the 707s were all retired and the 767s hadn't arrived yet. The Qantas 747 also has a special place in the heart of Darwinians, as in 1974 they set a record for a passenger load of 674 plus 23 crew members during an evacuation following Cyclone Tracy. So with Qantas retiring the remaining 747-400 ERs before the end of 2020, I'd love to hear more about your experiences on board them, and I suspect a lot of Aussies actually flew overseas for the first time on one of them. Now I've got a spare set of Qantas business pyjamas from another flight, so I'll be happy to give those away to a subscriber. Comment below on your experiences on board a Qantas 747, and after 30 days I'll select a winner and mail them out. Now just make sure you include the text Jumbo in brackets to enter. There are still more domestic Qantas 747 flights coming up, and they're well worth booking on. I had an absolute ball, and it was really cool on board a flight where most passengers were plane nerds. Once we reached cruising altitude, you could hear the hum of av gigs, reminiscing about the 747 and arguing about the 787's terrible window shades, how weird the A330 looks, and many other complex issues facing a Western civilization. It was a really fantastic day. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please check me out on Instagram and Facebook for my latest updates, including things like domestic 747 flights. In fact, I published these domestic flights well before the official Qantas press release that was picked up by the media early this year, hence why I've already got tickets for a few of them. If you're into planes, please check out my channel for many more videos. I've got a tour through a retired Qantas 747-400 at the Haas Aviation Museum, as well as a walk through the very first 747 currently retired in Seattle. I've also been on board the new Qantas Dreamliner, which is essentially the 747's replacement, and many other videos are coming soon, including onboard A330s, A350s, ATRs, and even this little Fokker F70. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you another time, and don't forget to enter in the pyjama giveaway. And finally, keep watching for the touching tribute to the Queen of the Skies by the customer service manager as we pull into the gate.
Welcome to Brisbane, where the time is 26 minutes past 12. You're a very pleasant onward journey. And just to follow on from the captain's remarks about the 747 being the Queen of the Skies, she certainly is. It has been for all of us a bit of a surprise to see how affectionately she is valued by all the community. For many of us who began our career on this aircraft and no doubt will finish it as well.